Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karen Messina and Dr. Felicia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. I'm Dr. Karen Messina. This is a special series of the New Books Network, and it's also sponsored by the American Psychoanalytic Association. I have the good fortune of being joined by our co-host, Dr. Felicia Powell-Williams. In this series, we talk about the tools and concepts of psychoanalysis and the persistence and dynamics of racism. And we try to think about how it can be assisted and learn more about defense mechanisms, psychoanalytic defense mechanisms. Now, we are going to plan to talk to other analysts and particularly Black psychoanalysts to help us comprehend and combat racism, to try to help us understand as much as we can. So we hope that we all learn something from this episode as well as ones in the future. Now, our topic today is the tug-of-war, and what I'm referring to is the racial progress that we seem to make at times, almost invariably followed by resistance and backlash. Just some general thoughts that I have, and then I'd love to know what Felicia thinks about this. But we seem to move forward on lots of fronts, and I can think of a number of examples. But then the establishment seems to get anxious. They seem to feel threatened. And I think it's the old order of things that seem to threaten people. And then there's this backlash, and it often comes in the form of retaliation. When people's identity is threatened, that's when it seems to happen. So I just have one quick example, and then we'll see what Dr. Powell-Williams thinks. So one thing that happened, people could call this a small thing or a big thing. To me, it's a big thing. The bust of Dr. Martin Luther King was removed from the White House when President Trump appeared. I don't know whose idea it was, but it was replaced by Winston Churchill's bust. Now, there was an outcry about that, and I believe that Dr. Martin Luther King's bust has been put back where it was. But why did that happen? What was the threat? Why do something like that? It took to get it there. So, yes, Felicia, please.
Well, yeah, thank you, Karen, for bringing that up. And this is really interesting as we start to discuss the tug-of-war and we start to discuss the threat and what might this mean. And there's various meanings that can be identified from, the removal of something. And from a psychoanalytic perspective, it is really important for us to identify how this could be a threat, and a threat in a way of, needing to hold some type of power or authority, but also being threatened as if there is some type of imagined loss. And I know we'll probably talk more about loss, but some type of way of being able to remove all of those things that we spoke of during our last podcast on, the historical components that can be so difficult for one to hold and contain. And so the removal of is a way, and can be an aggressive way in some instances, but it is a way of removing the difficulty and the pain and the hurt or the embarrassment or the shame or whatever the emotional experience it might be, that's hard for the person to be able to tolerate within themselves.
Well, that's a very, very good point.
But I'm curious, how did you think about that?
I was really offended because, as I've said so many times, I really like Dr. Martin Luther King a great deal, and his book, I think, is one of the best books in my collection of books, including all of them. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And certainly, it looks to me like we've chosen to go down the path of chaos. If you look at just about any political situation that's around, it certainly isn't filled with a sense of community. At least I don't feel that anymore, and I don't think many of my friends or patients do either. So he did say, if we don't settle this, if we don't solve this issue, in 1967 he said this, we're going to have a very difficult time. And basically, it's going to lead to chaos. And that's exactly what happened. So that came to my mind when I thought
Well,
of the situation.
Thank you for answering that and sharing your thoughts about it. Our first podcast was all about, looking at where do we go from here. And it just continues to resonate with me. And I am in total agreement with you. It is such a powerful book and one of my favorites in my own library. So when we think about community, the removal of the bust, was a very strong indicator also about not only the loss, maybe within the person or within the entity of removal, but what did it represent within the community to remove it? And we do know that Martin Luther King was such a strong observer of community and recognizing not only the differences in racial and ethnic identities, but also socioeconomic, and looking at all of those various layers that fit within there, equity, identity, all of those. And removing was, really a strong indicator that community didn't feel, how do I say this, Karen? It didn't feel welcomed.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And so as you describe, now there's this feeling of chaos. I think that that's what happens from a psychoanalytic perspective, that there is something that Dr. Martin Luther King presents in the book, but also the intrapsychic component of the split here, the split that, here's community, here is chaos. And how do we tend to carry that is really important. And how does it internally shift? Or is it identified within that psychoanalytic consulting room with many of our patients? And so we see that, and we're seeing that not only within the work that we're doing, but also socially, and how that also tends to affect how we absorb what is around us, how we are saturated with what is coming towards us, and how that affects, us, internally, our own psyche. So I think that your example that you presented us with today is a very important and very powerful example to continue to think about within our community.
Yes, I often find myself wondering what would have happened if Dr. King had lived, if he had survived.
Mm.
how many lessons we would have learned. If you don't mind, I'd like to read just a brief passage from the book when he was talking about whether he's
Please.
at Black people, and of course he calls them Negroes because it was 1967. It's an offensive word for me to even say, but it was a different time, so I'm going to read.
Yeah, let's quote him.
But he said that Negroes have taken Americans, white Americans, at their word when they talk about the objective of equality. But he goes on to say a sentence later, white America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects to retain it. Most of the aberrations between Negroes and white liberals arise from this fact. And I think that's so true. It's all a good game to talk about equality, but when people have to put their money where their mouths are, so to speak, it seems to be there's a different outcome. So if he had remained with us, maybe a very different world. But it's not, which brings me to something that's pretty current. And this is a hypothesis on my part, but not only on my part. It seemed kind of obvious, almost palpable in Washington. That had to do with this recent Juneteenth celebration. It was much different than the ones that occurred. They haven't been going on. There haven't been celebrations for too long, but for the last few years, or since 2021. And this time there was a subdued sense. I went to a local community celebration on the Saturday that followed, and it was wonderful. There was just wonderful people, wonderful community, but it was in a small subset of Washington, D.C., so it was different. And I noted that President Trump said a day or so afterwards, I believe it was afterwards, that there are too many paid holidays in the United States and something has to be done about that. And then he said it right after Juneteenth, made me wonder if he has plans to do something. And then the press secretary said the same thing. I believe it was the following Monday. So she said, we observed the holiday, but she didn't say that it was celebrated. And it should be celebrated. And that was the whole idea, that it would be celebrated. I mean, that people would know that there was an end to slavery in the United States. And that's the celebration part, not the observation of it. So this idea of it being observed, coupled with President Trump saying there are too many paid holidays, and Americans agree with him, which I'd like to see some statistics on that one. But anyway, that's a current thing that concerned me. And it seemed to be a good example of the defense mechanism of denial, for one thing.
That's right. And America is a country filled with much denial. And when we start to look at things such as slavery and those type of social injustices, racial injustices, we tend to, experience not only the hurt, but also the shame and the difficulty with holding that shame and holding that hurt so that we can look at what is it that, how do we get to that place? Where are we now? And how do we continue to navigate our way in which we hope for more of a sense of, equity, a sense of being able to recognize differences and embrace that and be able to talk about them and learn from them. We're just not quite there. That is very difficult for many to do. And often within the denial, within that defense, then there is this need to suppress and put things away, to bury them deeply in a place that there doesn't have to be any awareness of what the hurt and the shame is all about. And so we get into these places that we definitely need to be able to examine. But it's really hard when society, and not all in society, but I just use that generally, has difficulties in knowing how to sit with this and process this. And there was this way of beginning to embrace it. But it is very difficult, as we talked about in previous podcasts, to be seen, to allow those differences, to allow race and ethnicity, age, and all of the many diversities that are there to be seen and to be celebrated with all of its beauty, but with all of its pain and hurt, with all of its shame. And so they are put away. And then there's so much there that I remember the day of or the day after in very different way of how I heard that comment. There were too many non-working holidays. And so, what does that mean? And it does go back to something you're talking about, and it's celebratory. How do we celebrate emancipation? How do we look at the fact that there was something that really required and respected to be celebrated, but perhaps there were all of these different defense mechanisms that, we talk about, mainly denial, that kept us from being able to celebrate in such a way as we've experienced before in the past. But it is hard when we are living in a society that doesn't want to look at the realities, that doesn't want to, as we see book burnings or removals from libraries and those particular, classics that share with us our history, removal of individuals that really hold history for us in national libraries, the silencing of, historical pieces. And again, we're going to suppressing and putting away things and not allowing that voice to be there, not allowing the awareness and the reality to be there because of whatever one really struggles or grapples with, and being able to hold it and work with it in that moment and what it means for them. But I'll stop because I know you have a lot of thoughts about this and would love to hear what you're thinking at this time.
Actually, as you were talking, I was thinking about DEI and the rollback on that. And we've talked about that before, but I'm going to keep talking about it because it has to be dealt with.
Let's do. Keep talking about it.
Yeah, it's not good enough. One time isn't good enough. 100 times isn't good enough until there's change. But this idea of stopping things because it's reverse discrimination, and we have to make things race neutral, is again an example of moving forward and then moving backwards. So 2 steps forward, 3 or 4 steps backwards. This tug of war, forward and then back. And I think it's because people are threatened. The order of things, there's disequilibrium, and when people do that, they go backwards. And I think so. Another mechanism of defense, I think, is undoing. You do something, and then the anxiety pops up, and then you undo it. And of course, this isn't conscious. It's not conscious most of the time. Some of these things I can't help but believe but they're not more malicious than unconscious wishes. But that's beside the point. Defense mechanisms are, as we talk about them, they are unconscious things that are going on in our minds. But also, as you were talking about the kinds of books we can read, there's also a backlash when it comes to critical race theory. I mean, there's places where you're not allowed to teach American children what happened in America. You have to just whitewash all that as if slavery didn't happen. I mean, how absurd to my way of thinking. Why would anybody do that? Well, again, probably because they're threatened. I think it was Florida who has the Stop Woke Act, anti-CRT laws. I mean, it's absurd. That's what I think about.
It just reminded me when you were talking about the critical race theory and how it is difficult for some people to, just want to sit with the facts, want to sit with the truth. And recently I've heard this, I think it's been a year or two ago, but, I'm listening to some things on the radio, and someone said, well, the slaves were excited to be in that position because they were learning new technical skills of how to survive, and so it was as if slavery had become this useful tool because it was educating the slaves on how to go out and farm the land and how to just exist during these times. And I'm sitting with this, and how important it was to reword history, to reconstruct it because of one's own difficulty with holding the truth, with holding the facts, and turning something into, complete fabrication that, did the slaves, does anyone request to be beaten and request to be treated in humane situations, to live in these type of conditions? And so it was really interesting as it's being celebrated as, this way of teaching skills. There was a dismissing the pain, the trauma, the abuse, the separation of families, just lynchings, killings, rape. All of these layers and layers of realities and facts that no one wanted to talk about and to put a new spin on something because it's too hard to tolerate. It's too hard to tolerate the reality, the facts, the truth. Now we see this in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, especially, when we are working with anyone. But primarily I'm thinking here even with children, the difficulty with being able to tolerate their own frustration, their own sadness, their own fears, and how difficult that is, but how important it is to be able to help them analytically look at what those are and how to be able to tolerate and hold that in a way that can be very useful as they go and through the developmental stance in their lives. So this is really interesting to hear, how hard it is even in this day and age to look at those realities and to be able to tolerate one's own frustrations, own fears and anxiety, big feelings about the truth, what's there, and being able to take ownership of this is history. This is just history here that is powerful and real and needs to be accepted the way that we can accept. What did George Washington do? What did Sam Houston do? All of those realities are important to talk about. But when it comes to all of the things of seeing, racial and ethnic differences, those are things that tend to be silenced. The way that we can talk about the removal of Black Lives Matter from, in front of the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, removing, silencing, putting away.
That's a great example of the past and the present, moving forward, moving backwards. You were talking about slavery, and I actually like the way you wove in child development and what we do as analysts, since we're both child analysts too, how we help children learn to tolerate things, to tolerate difficulties, pain, sorrow, anger, and deal with these things in appropriate ways. And the way you were talking about the past and slavery and also Black Lives Matter. And that movement was really energizing to people. I believe it was around 2020. They were in the streets talking about it after George Floyd's murder. But then what happens? Again, progress, moving forward, anxiety pops up, and then we move backwards. So there's fear of loss of control and racial scapegoating. It's the other guy. So projection comes into the picture. It's on me. It's you. From my books, as I've mentioned. So that's another thing that we help children and adult patients with all the time, tolerating the anxiety, not acting out. And then there's also mourning, the importance of mourning things. Mourning
that could be so difficult.
Right. And what happens when when people don't go through that stage, when the mourning process is avoided or denied? Well, we know what happens. History repeats itself. There's a
That's right.
The same old things pop up again, maybe in a different form, but there they are again. Whereas if one processed the loss, the mourning, then it wouldn't have to be that way. I think we could talk about this topic for a very long time. But I think that we'll have to wrap it up for today. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. If you found this episode to be interesting, please share it with someone you know. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.